Oh yeah, this is on time.
Good evening. You could give me a little more. It's nice out. Good evening.
Evening.
So yeah, there you go. Check out one thing. This is a little bit of a plug to come here for services because they usually start about an hour earlier than this. But check out that window. Check out that window was made for that spot this season, this time of the evening. So the whole thing is illuminated. Even the fire on the mountain. Those who know what I'm talking about know what I'm talking about up at the top there. So it is wonderful to see all of you here this evening for this very, very special opportunity and an incredibly timely opportunity to hear from these really thought leaders and commentators and scholars on issues and subjects that are near and dear to our heart. Of course, today is Yom HaAtzmaut. Today is, it's just finishing right now, Israel Independence Day, which was, if you've been following it at all, a bit more muted in Israel than might normally be the case for obvious reasons. But as much as our hearts and our thoughts and prayers go out to the people of Israel in terms of everything that they're enduring, there's another front to the post-October 7th world that we're also confronting here in the United States, vis-a-vis both market increases in anti-Semitism, but also in terms of what it means to be supportive of Israel, what it means to care about Israel, and the wide spectrum of opinion within the Jewish community is in many ways, I think, threatening the cohesion and the unity of the Jewish community. And it's something that we have to really be cautious about, particularly in the run-up to the election and everything attendant to that, but just I think in general, at a time of our ultimate vulnerability, the fact that we are so divided, it's seemingly in so many different ways, is a real cause for concern. I'd like to just offer a couple expressions of gratitude. First and foremost to Michelle and Stan Rosen for underwriting and sponsoring this event. If we can give them a wonderful expression of gratitude. To my colleague, Rabbi Kate Spicer, who does so many wonderful things, curating, organizing, all the things that help with so many of the wonderful adult engagement opportunities that we have here at the synagogue. This evening was in many ways a year plus in the making. I had been followers of both of these gentlemen and some of their more recent books and the follow-up op-eds, what have you, appearances on television, and was anxious to bring them out here well prior to October 7th, just in response to what was going on in Israel at the time in terms of the conflict over the judicial coup and the marked increase of anti-Semitism prior to October 7th. Little did I know, anybody who planned anything before October 7th, little did any of us know that the times, the challenges, the obstacles, the trials would be even more amplified than originally intended. And so the timeliness of this gathering and this subject in particular, which is roiling state houses, the federal government, college campuses for sure, the timing could not be more pertinent and germane. What I'm also hoping to do this evening is not only to explore a subject matter, the content of which is really important for us to engage and to delve into, but I'm also hoping, as I build this event, for this to truly be a machloket l'shem shamayim, a debate for the sake of heaven, and hopefully modeling what we Jews have always valued as a critical dynamic in our tradition, and that is vibrant but civil discourse, debate, assuming the best intention of the other person and that there are some more things that we share than those things that divide us. Unfortunately, we in the Jewish community have fallen victim to some of the trends in the wider community with the inability to talk to one another, to disagree without demonizing one another. And I'm hoping this evening will provide an opportunity to model both that dynamic while delving into the content. Now, a little bit about our speakers very briefly. I could read I don't know if I'll read the entire thing. It's like a eulogy here. David Bernstein is a passionate advocate of the free expression of ideas in State of Israel. David Bernstein is the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, JILV, check it out, which opposes illiberal ideologies and supports liberal values in and out of the Jewish community, and is the author of Woke Anti-Semitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. As I mentioned, co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values, past president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, former executive director of the David Project, worked closely with the American Jewish Committee, and a host of other things. Kenneth S. Stern is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. He is an award-winning author and attorney and was most recently executive director of the Justice and Karen Rosenberg Foundation. Before that, he was director of the Division on Anti-Semitism and Extremism at the American Jewish Committee. They both hung out at the AJC, where he worked for 25 years. His op-eds and book reviews have appeared in all the major legacy media outlets and probably even some of the more cutting-edge new ones. He's argued before the United States Supreme Court. He was the lead drafter of the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working definition of anti-Semitism. Was integral in the defense in the historic London Holocaust denial case of David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt. And it says newest book, but it was 4 years ago. He's working on another one. The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate. Wow, could not be more on the nose than that. It is my honor and pleasure to share with you David Bernstein and Ken Stern. Give them a round of applause, please. Thank you. So what I'd like to do is, before we kind of delve into the subject matter at hand, I want to kind of ask a personal question. No, I won't ask the questions that we asked at lunch as icebreakers about, whether you like sufganiyot or chomentashen or whatever that was, but rather just on a very personal level. How are you personally in this trying moment, in this post-October 7th moment, with all its implications for both Israel and for you as an American Jew, as visible American Jews in the wider cultural context? How are you doing just affectively before we start probing into the intellectual depths of your experience, please?
Well, for all of us, I suspect, October 7th is a huge one of those before and after events, like the Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination. Those are things that mark. Is it not?
Just goes up, needs to
Go up. Okay. That works. Okay. Okay, that better? Good. Okay. So it's one of those times where we don't know what the other side of it's going to be, and I've been writing again about Israel and the campus and anti-Semitism, and I've known that every time there's shooting involving Israel, anti-Semitism goes up. That's, if we're going to talk about the definition later, the background to the writing of the definition was an observation at the Second Intifada that sparked a lot of the the uptick in attacks on Jews in Europe in 2000 and 2001. We've seen that every time. The last couple of times we've been lucky. When Israel was involved with wars in Gaza, campus has been out, either in the winter or the summer. This time it's not just, it's going on for a couple of weeks and it's ending. We don't know when the end is. The precipitating event was horrendous and brutal and shook us all to the core. And on the pro-Palestinian side, as much as we see things that relate to stories that we've heard about the Holocaust in our families or pogroms, from the pro-Palestinian side, this is also a traumatic event that raises the Nakba. So how we get to the other side, I don't know. How we're dealing with it at the moment.
How are you feeling?
I'm feeling, we all do what we can. And in some ways, it's odd you were talking about the book coming out 4 years ago. So, I mean, Carol will remember, Carol Gown, I wrote a book on the militia movement, right? And it was the first one out of the gate because I had written a report for AJC about the militia movement and talked in a covering memo about the likelihood of attacks on the anniversary of Waco. So I figured I had great timing with one book. This one came out March of 2020 and went to the warehouses, and the publisher said, you know, let's wait till this pandemic thing is over. By May, I said, we got to get it out. And it fell into that part where nobody was, you know, going into offices, the reviewers to wipe books down with Clorox. So it fell into this hole. I did do a little bit of talking about it, but after the attacks, it's gotten some attention. So what I'm focusing on is I wrote the book because I was concerned that on both sides, on the pro-Israel side and the pro-Palestinian side, there was an attempt to censor things that were being taught on campus by different means, but I saw that as destructive to the campus itself. And you know, I hate to keep looking at Carol, but she'll remember Gary Rubin from AJC, who was the director of national affairs, who always made the point about how important the campus institution was to the Jewish community. And I was seeing that being attacked and threatened by the attempts for both sides to censor. So one of the things that I focus on is it's given me an opportunity to go and talk, not entirely successfully, I can tell you some unsuccessful intercessions with college boards and stuff, but to focus on these issues about how colleges should deal with these issues, how they should prioritize academic freedom, how should they make a distinction. I think this overlaps with some of what David's concerns are about making sure that students are protected from actual harassment, threats, and so forth, but they're exposed to ideas that are ones that will challenge them, and how to recreate that. So it's given me the opportunity to talk about the things that I found were important when I wrote the book in 2020, and now people are at least eager to hear some of those ideas.
Wonderful, thank you. David, how are you doing?
Yeah, okay. I think I've set into a new normal, for better or worse. I was at this retreat this last week with Jewish thought leaders and foundation heads and so forth, and one woman said, since October 7th, I've been so angry. And she talked to a rabbi mentor of hers who said, no, it's not anger you're feeling, it's fear. And I think I feel a mix of that. I wrote a book, uncontroversial book called Woke Anti-Semitism, a year and a half before, a year before October 7th. And I talked about how an oppressor-oppressed ideology is conditioning people to see the world in a certain way, and that's going to come back to haunt us. And of course, it's played out much faster in a much more dramatic fashion than I ever could imagine. But being a meaning maker in some ways, helping others think through what this means to us collectively, helps in a way psychologically deal with it. I'm able to navigate it because I'm helping others navigate it in my own way. And so that's how I felt. That's a better place to be than I think confused. And I've talked to a lot of people who are confused about where they stand. I was at this, I gave a speech where I was warned that there was this very progressive board member who might be alienated by some of the things I'm going to say. And by the time we got there to the Q&A, the person said, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know where I fit into society. I feel like the friends that I've always had abandoned me. And I felt terrible. It's just not where I was because I had been struggling with this for a lot longer. I was less surprised. Look, even as someone who wrote about it and even someone who warned about it, I was surprised when 31 student groups at Harvard on October 9th issued a statement basically supporting the Hamas terrorist acts against Israel and blaming Israel for the attacks. It exceeded my expectations, but I still had a system of meaning in place. And I hope we're all starting to find our systems of meaning now that we've had several months to sort of digest what's happened.
So this is perhaps both an obvious question, but one that I think warrants kind of a deeper dive that I think will reflect some of the views that you have and perhaps some of the distinctions. You know, what's contributed to the significant changes in perceptions of Israel over the last few months from unqualified victim of atrocity to a potential pariah, more broadly, even beyond the Jewish community? What has contributed to that significant, I described it after October 7th, the ferocity and the velocity of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bile was so dramatic. What contributed to that significant and quick turnaround?
Well, you know, I think first of all, it's not new in some ways, some of the ideology. I want to just see if anybody recognizes something that I pulled out, a statement. I want to see if anybody can figure out where this came from. It says, on the Palestinian movement, said, people have been confused and misled into thinking that the situation in the Mideast is impossibly complicated. Blindness to the Palestinian people is the root of this quandary. The Palestinian struggle is a genuine and deeply rooted movement for national liberation. As a people, they have actively opposed colonialization of their lands from the beginning against the Turkish rulers, against the British Empire, and now against Zionism as embodied in the State of Israel. This is the key to the past and the future of the Mideast. There is a sobering similarity between the situation of the Palestinians and the history of Native American people. The reality is that Israel is an expansionist power based on Zionist colonialism. Anybody have a guess about who wrote that? What? One of our presidents. No.
Ben Gurion.
Okay, nope. Anybody going to guess Students for Justice in Palestine? Nope. Jewish Voice for Peace? Nope. The Weather Underground, 1974, Prairie Fire. So, you know, it's not entirely new, and what I see...
You may have to tell people who the Weather Underground
Weather Underground was the I figured it's an older audience.
There are folks here who I don't think know who the
offshoot of the Students for Democratic Society. They were a Marxist group that was, you know, responding to Vietnam by blowing up things. So, you know, the idea of, to me, the idea of Israel as a pariah is not new. There's always been this you know, peace in the left. But it's not unique in that type of thinking. What I see is there's a desire, and this is I see from hate studies, which is what my day job is, that people, when they see some aspect of their identity tethered to an issue of social justice or injustice, certain things we know happen from brain science and other things. We know that people crave simplicity, they crave certainty, they crave the other side is not only wrong, it's evil. It makes us more comforted to be in those buckets, to see good and evil and right and wrong. And the Israel part has been the backdrop to this for a while, post-67. It's interesting because if you look back at the history of the left at 48, it was very pro-Israel. You could look at some of the National Lawyers Guilds and other groups. It was like a Leon Uris novel in terms of the pro-Israel stuff. But the politics changed post-67, and this has always sort of been there in the background. It was sort of muted during South Africa because that was the #1 issue. But I think once that resolved, this was one that was percolating, and I was seeing some of that in the campus, and part of it is because there's a generational divide. A lot of people in this room remember 67, remember 73. A lot of younger folks have no memories of that other than Israel as being a strong power, and they also have seen Israel as occupying the West Bank and controlling Palestinian lives, certainly since 67. So it's a different dynamic that was all set up there. And I think what I was struck by the same thing you were. I found it deplorable that the student groups made that statement without qualification. There were a variety of voices that were pro-Palestinian and Arab voices. that some of which were very strong pro-Palestinian post-October 7th, but at least acknowledged the horror of what Hamas did. But there were some who didn't, and those students didn't. And I think the way I understand it is they were so focused on the right and wrong, Palestinian liberation and so forth, that they saw the attacks of October 7th as a way that got the Palestinian story back to the front pages. And the lack of empathy for the human loss was just part of how they saw that, because they were so focused on only this one thing as opposed to the common humanity. And that to me is some of the drivers of it. So it isn't like that anti-Semitism is the only explanation for some of what we've seen. I mean, certainly some of it is, but it's the sort of binary thinking where people could only look at one thing. And we see it in society and other things too. We'll see it around the 2024 election. We see it around abortion. We see it around immigration. We're in a moment where so much thinking is, this is the set of ideas I subscribe to, and the other side is evil. And I see this as a manifestation of that.
So David, apart from kind of the pre-existing, the antecedents to this that Ken was talking about, why is this time uniquely so dramatically critical of Israel and by extension the Jewish people? Is there something larger going on in our culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are larger forces going on in our culture, and I think many of us missed it, by the way. I mean, we might have intuited it to a certain degree, but we missed the larger ideological shifts. I love the iceberg metaphor. I'm sure you've seen it in various PowerPoint presentations over the years. You have the part of the iceberg that is above the waterline, and you have a much deeper seated reality below the waterline. And I think we tend to focus above the waterline. This is the anti-Semitism. This is the anti-Zionism. And we really haven't looked beneath the waterline of what was going on in our society that was shifting ideological attitudes and molding public opinion in a way that might have brought us to where we are today. When I was at the American Jewish Committee, and Ken and I overlapped many years and been friends for many years. When I was in the American Jewish Committee in 2008, I believe, it was the first Hamas attack, rocket attack, an Israeli counterattack. And I remember I used to track these. I used to track how the major editorial pages covered it. New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and Boston Globe, and Washington Post. They followed this pattern. 2008, 2014, 2018, they followed this pattern where they would start by giving Israel some leeway because it was being attacked. And within 3 or 4 days, once the casualties started to mount, you could feel the coverage change. And they said, now Israel has to stop. And I remember in 2021, May 2021, it was completely different. There was no leeway at all. Israel, and the narrative hadn't shifted much. Israel was being, attacked by rockets. Israel responded. And this time, the press coverage was negative from the outset. And the social media was horrific from the outset. And I was trying to figure out what had changed. And I think it's this larger ideological environment. I spent more than 5 years as the executive director of an organization called the David Project, training and educating college students on Israel. And I remember the attitudes around 2010 to 2013, I would describe them as soft postmodernism. What do I mean by that? Most students looked at the Arab-Israel conflict and they say there's the Palestinian story and there's the Israeli story. Every group has the right to its own story, and we should respect all stories. Now, I thought that was a bit of a simplistic worldview. I mean, it's got some utility, but it doesn't mean that just because you have a story that you're right and the other is wrong. You need a larger moral view. But we could work with it. We could say, okay, so the pro-Israel students, rather than arguing all the time about who started the Six-Day War, can instead tell their story about why they feel connected to the Jewish state. What is their personal connection? And that's what we retrain students to do. And also because, that's where our students want it to be as well. Our Jewish students and pro-Israel students want it to be. And around 2013, 2014, you could feel a shift. I remember we brought a student from University of California, Davis, who had been involved in BDS. We didn't know this when we took her to Israel at the time, but she'd been involved in the BDS movement. And she came up to me during the trip and apologized for that, and it was just a sort of wonderful validation of what we had been doing. And then after that summer, and this was during the Ferguson riots, and this was the onset of new social media channels like Tumblr, you could feel the shift. It went from being sort of soft postmodernist to hard postmodernist. Now all of a sudden, a lot of the student activists were dividing up the world in very simplistic terms into oppressed and oppressor, and they were bringing that worldview into the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And we could no longer, sort of be in conversation with a lot of the student activists that we thought we had sort of brought into our realm. And so I think that there have been these major ideological shifts taking place in society that bring us to where we are today. And you have to look beneath the waterline if you really want to understand them.
Thank you. So let's delve a little bit into the elephant in the room, so to speak, and something that is as germane and timely as the legislation that was passed by Congress last week about anti-Semitism and the IHRA definition, which you, Ken, were instrumental in developing. I'm going to go counterintuitively and ask him about it first, and then I'll come to you.
Absolutely.
So, isn't it a fairly accurate and comprehensive definition of anti-Semitism, particularly for civic leaders and institutions who have a well-intended need to better understand how Jews experience anti-Semitism in a moment when all of us are called upon to be acutely sensitive to the lived experience of marginalized communities?
Yeah, look, I like the IRA definition. I thought you were spot on when you developed it. I understand why Ken and others are worried about how it's being used. I'm not sure we differ on that much, although I don't rate the problems in the same way Ken does. So look, why do we have a definition? Why do we need a definition at all? I think that's the right place to start. I'm not a huge fan of these definitions. Why? Very often in today's discourse, groups will assert, I'm black, so therefore I get to assert what racism is. I'm Muslim, I get to assert what Islamophobia is. I'm gay, I get to assert what homophobia is. And you all have to sort of go along with us because only we have the lived experience of oppression and only we can define it, only we can see it, only we have the insight into it. I think there's value in hearing people's narratives, particularly people who have experienced oppression and discrimination, but no one gets to tell me what to think. I mean, I'm an independent person. You're independent people. You get to have your own opinions about what's really going on in society. And there's more than one data point. Our lived experience is not the only data point, right? I mean, we're many of us, probably, if not all of us, are Jewish here. We don't experience anti-Semitism in the same way. And when I read that the Pew survey that in 2019 that American Jews are the most admired religious community in the United States, that's another data point that may be at odds with my own lived experience. So I don't like these definitions, but I understand that if we're going to have anti-discrimination laws, and we do, and if we're going to have hate crimes laws, and we do, and we're going to have government agencies monitoring anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination, and we do, they have to understand what discrimination is against Jews. What is the hatred against Jews? And I think the IRA definition is a perfectly good definition. The question is, how is it being used? Now, I believe it should be used to discern the intent and to study the phenomena. We need to understand what's happening. We need to be able to study it. And so in a hate crimes law, what does that mean? If you were the victim of somebody punching you, right? That would be a crime. If you found out that the person punched you because you're Jewish, that would be a hate crime. What IRA does is it allows us to say, well, the person didn't say, you're a Jew, I'm going to punch you. The person said, I hate Israel, and I'm going to punch you. And that can then be understood as a hate crime. I think we're able to use that to discern intent. I think that's fine and important. I have some misgivings about how much emphasis we're placing on IRA and on anti-discrimination more generally in this fight, and we can talk about that later. So I think it's a perfectly legitimate definition. I think it does cause some problems, which I think Ken is going to talk about, but I think he exaggerates those problems. Okay.
So Ken, give us both the origin story and your critique.
Sure. So the origin story is that there was a group called the European Monitoring Center that was tasked with, across the EU, putting together reports about racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and so forth. And post the collapse of the peace process in 2000, and the Second Intifada, we saw the spike in attacks on Jews, and they put together a report in 2004 that was pretty right in what it found. It found the attacks on Jews in Paris and London and other places were not just the traditional suspects of the white supremacists, but a lot of young Arab and Muslim folks as well. But they said, correctly, they said, we have a problem. We have all these data collectors in different countries all around Europe, and there's no common score sheet of what to look for. And we want to create a tool so that we could look at anti-Semitism across time and across borders. So we need something that's sort of uniform so people are looking at the same thing. I absolutely agreed. They said as a temporary measure, they were going to have a definition about anti-Semitism that really collected a bunch of stereotypes about Jews. And that was going to be the driving temporary one, but they needed a new one. So they also said, what do you do if a Jew is attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli? And they said, well, if the person had these stereotypes about Jews and applied them to Israelis and reapplied them to the poor Jew in front of them on the streets of Paris or someplace and attacked them, that's anti-Semitism. But if they were upset at the policies of something that Israel did and attacked the Jew, that's lamentable but shouldn't be counted. And I thought, this is nuts, right? And, again, I grew up in the 60s. Imagine that some black person had been lynched because somebody had these stereotypes about black people. But that's racism, but not if somebody was upset about a civil rights legislation passing or Martin Luther King's speech and hung the same person. That's crazy. So what happened is that our colleague Andy Baker at AJC invited the head of EUMC, a woman named Beata Winkler, to come and be part of a panel on the last day of an AJC annual meeting. And about 3 weeks or so before that, Israel assassinated a Hamas leader. And the reaction was in Montreal, a Jewish day school was firebombed. Nobody was hurt, thank God. But I took the opportunity, and Carol and David will remember, you're not as late as staff, you're not supposed to go up and question people. I figured, I got to do this. I went up, took the microphone and said to her, how could that be that this is not considered anti-Semitism? So that opened up the opportunity for AJC to work with her. Andy did the politicking. I put together, I was the lead drafter of the definition. And the heart of it is all these examples because we wanted the data collectors to know what to look at and what not to look at. And there were a bunch about Israel because we saw, again, the correlation, not causation, of the things that were said about Israel with the uptick in attacks on Jews. So that was good for what we wanted. It also had language that really has been overlooked, which I thought was spot on about hate crimes. And this is where I disagree with David. It's U.S. law. There's a case called Wisconsin v. Mitchell. Looks at hate crime and basically it says you don't have to hate. You just have to select somebody based on who they are. So it's not a question about motive. Motive can be relevant, but it's a question of intent. So it doesn't matter if I attack a Jew because I'm upset with Israel or I attack a Jew because I have hatred towards Jews, just like if I attack an Asian person or a black person. You don't need that. You just need to show the specific intent to target that person. And we wanted to take that type of law and standard and try to encourage Europeans to follow that too, because you'll remember a couple years later, there was a Jew that was kidnapped because Jews were supposedly rich and held for ransom. And people were debating, is that a positive stereotype, a negative stereotype, and so forth. So, we didn't want that. We wanted just to attack them because of who they are. Okay, so that was how that happened in 2004, 2005. Rolled forward into 2010. The Department of Education clarifies that Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities are protected under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits a pervasively hostile environment for students on campus, but doesn't talk about religion. It talks about race and other categories. So as ethnicity, so this is great. So one of the things I was proudest of when I was at AJC, there were a bunch of Jewish high school students outside of Binghamton where there was a Kick a Jew Day and swastikas on desks and the school did nothing. And here we had a new tool. This is great. We could threaten them funding if they didn't do something about it. And I filed a complaint and we won. Great. What happened? Jewish groups on the right, pro-Israel groups, ZOA and others, had this great idea. Let's take this new power under Title VI. Let's use the definition. Let's start filing lawsuits. So some of the lawsuits they filed had things that were actionable, spitting and shoving, but they were looking at what professors were teaching, what speakers were coming to a campus, what was assigned, how people were talking in the academy, and trying to make that verboten. And the concern I had then, and I have now, is less about the legal cases, but about administrators knowing their job is to protect a school from being sued. So they're going to try to push back against pro-Palestinian speech because there are all these groups out there that are waiting to file lawsuits. So that was the gravamen of what I was concerned about with the definition. They lost all the cases. They tried to get the law passed in 2016 and 2017. It didn't. Trump signed the executive order. And now we've seen sort of an explosion of trying to push us as, I think, more as a symbol, but what it does is a couple of things, and then I'll shut up so you can do the next question. One thing is it feeds into that binary thinking where we think that there are simple solutions to complicated problems. So we could talk more broadly about how anti-Semitism actually functions in the world, but when we think we're going to have here's a law that's going to define certain speech that's not okay, that takes us away. We should have a wide lens of how anti-Semitism works. It looks at this very narrow thing. And the second thing is, and this I disagree with David, there is no other type of bigotry for which there is a definition for Title VI purposes, not for racism. But imagine if there were. Imagine if the same sort of origin story happened with racism. Let's have a definition of racism that has some political examples. So let's say opposition to affirmative action. Not everybody who's opposed to affirmative action is a racist, but you could say that there's a correlation there between the climate of racism and the opposition to affirmative action, or Black Lives Matter, or opposition to removal of Confederate statues. Would you want that enshrined by Congress and states to say this is how we're going to define racism? I don't think so, and I don't think that's how we should deal with anti-Semitism either.
Maybe I should respond.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with you on that. I'm going to use the phrase that I use in my book. I think differently about it. Takes the edge off. But look, if anything, Jewish complaints about discrimination are taken much less seriously than other complaints. Imagine for a second, Ken, we're in a southern state with a very conservative university, and a group of students, representing a wide swath of student groups, says we are not going to allow any speaker who supports same-sex marriage. I think the university, if this would absolutely stop that from happening. In other words, I think that they're less sensitive to political speech when it comes to Jews than they are to almost anybody else. And I think that's one of the reasons why the December 5th hearings were so jolting. It's not, look, I understand, yes, you can put charges of genocide or from the river to the sea in context, and on a technical level, those presidents didn't say anything that was explicitly wrong. But everybody knows that those same university presidents were enforcing every microaggression on campus. And we know that they would not allow pass a lot of what's happening now. We know that if there were protests outside, let's say, a black fraternity, that it would that people the student perpetrators would have hell to pay, and rightly so. We know that if there were a group of students from a foreign country like you had at MIT who came in and harassed Jews, really crossed the line. This was not an act of speech. And the university president said, well, we're not going to prosecute them because they would lose their student visas. I mean, we would not, no one would put up with that. So I think that, maybe no other group has a definition. Maybe we need a definition because people simply don't understand what Jewish students and Jews are facing.
Ken, please,
Sure.
that, and maybe comment on the congressional hearings as well.
Oh, yeah, well,
But whatever.
sure. I agree with you in part because I think there is a double standard, and I think that's part of what makes it, jarring, because I think there has been more attention to anti-trans, anti-Muslim in some ways, not always, anti-black and so forth. But I think that the standard that we're articulating now in terms of how to deal with speech and to look at the difference between harassment and speech is an important one that I think can bring the campus back to where it should be and not to intercede in those things. But when you mentioned I've been doing a lot of media on this. One of the things I went back to, I was at AJC when David Duke was running for governor and statewide office and had been elected to the legislature, the former KKK leader. And I went back to the backgrounder I wrote for AJC, and I saw that when he was a student at LSU, he got up at the free speech spot, and actually it was not only on the free speech spot, but on a radio show too, said that every black person should be deported back to Africa, every Jew should be exterminated, and then the next year he was parading around in an actual Nazi uniform on the campus, right? If he had been disciplined for just the articulation of that awful idea, as opposed to being vilified for it, which he was, he would have loved it. It would have made him into a free speech martyr and changed the dynamic from his bigotry to his right to speak. So I think there's an opportunity here to recalibrate, because I agree with you. There has been the focus on the microaggressions, and one of the things that I testified about in 2017 was precisely this point. I said, look, the Jewish community was saying, and they put it in some of the background material to the Senate legislation in 2016, was a case of a professor that had tweeted something that was seen as homophobic and was suspended. Students at one school thought you shouldn't show the film American Sniper because it was anti-Muslim. It was stopped. And they said, protect us too, rather than saying these are examples that shouldn't be followed.
So let's, thank you. Let's, in trying to parse kind of the essence of our discussion, where is the line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? I resonate with something Daniel Hartman recently said, that anti-Zionism often functions as anti-Semitism. So the question is, when is anti-Semitism merely an acceptable surrogate for anti-Zionism, merely an acceptable surrogate for anti-Semitism? And when, if it's still possible post-October 7th, for anti-Zionism to be a principal distinction between love for Judaism and contempt for Zionism as an ideology and Israel as a reality?
Yeah, and again, it's one of those things that people are looking for, where's the line? And it's more complex than that, right? So there are some things that are clearly from anti-Zionism that are anti-Semitic. When you cut and paste, the classic tropes about Jews and put them on Israel, no question. When you use classic conspiracy theory, and there are at least three definitions floating around. It's not only the IRA one, there's the Nexus one, and the Jerusalem Declaration. They all have at heart the idea of anti-Semitism in different words, but it's conspiracy theory charging Jews with trying to harm humanity and explaining what goes wrong in the world. So when you do that with Israel and in the same sort of way, that's anti-Semitism. Other side, I'm a Palestinian. Is my objection to Zionism because I hate Jews, or because of what the reestablishment of the State of Israel meant for me and my people? You may believe that we should just have one big, society with one person, one vote. I think that would be a disaster. I'm a strong proponent of the two-state solution, of the least worst, option. But I'm not going to say that that's hateful of Jews. Plus, you look at some of the younger folks who are in, again, very much a minority, but very vocal in groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. And the stories I hear from them go something like this, because also a lot of them are ones that are the kids and grandkids of people that were involved in groups like AJC and ADL and federations and so forth. And they basically go like this. I was raised in a Jewish family. I may have gone to Jewish day school. I go to college, and I hear there's something called an occupation. And I've never heard about that before. And I feel betrayed, and I feel lied to. But it's important for me to look at the world through Jewish values. And those values talk about how do I repair the world, and how do I treat the stranger. So I may disagree with them, but I'm not going to call them anti-Semitic by any means. Now, I would agree with you that there is a correlation with an uptick in anti-Zionism and expressions of anti-Semitism. I was very involved in trying to, and actually organized when I was at AJC, the piece at the U.S. mission to launch the repeal of the Zionism racism resolution that the UN had passed in 1975 and repealed in 1991. And part of the rationale for opposing the definition used that way was that it created an environment where Jews were discriminated against. Jews in some colleges in the UK, they were told if you're Jew, you're a Zionist, you're a racist, you can't have a Jewish group. So there is that correlation, but there's a lot of gray area looking at intent and who's saying it and what their means are. And I think we have to be, okay with a lot of things that we can't put on one side or the other of a line about what Zionism means.
David, anti-Zionism, is there a distinction between some forms of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Writ large, I think anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. Writ large, though, is, I think, an important qualifier. It is very strange that there are people that say the Jewish state of Israel has no right to exist. We don't say that about any other country that's been around for a while. It's one thing to argue that a current national group shouldn't have a state, but once you have a state and you function as a state, it's very strange, and we should regard that as highly problematic, and I think it is properly understood as a category of anti-Semitism. Look, I agree with Ken's exceptions. If you're a Satmar Chassid and you think that we should have waited till the Messiah came, are you an anti-Semite? I don't think so. If you're somebody who believes that that all states are illegitimate, you think that the Jewish state of Israel is illegitimate, does that make you an anti-Semite? I don't think so. And so I'm not that eager to go around calling people anti-Semites, and I think Ken and I agree on that. We want to be very sparing in that it's one thing to call phenomena anti-Semitic, writ large, but it's another thing to cite every single example of it and say, oh, you're an anti-Semite, or that's anti-Semitic. And I just think we should be careful so we don't demean the word itself and the power of the word itself. But as Ken was sort of suggesting, and I think this is very true, we can talk about the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism at an abstract level, but at an empirical level, they're going very often hand in hand. I know, Ken, you wrote and talked about what happened at Berkeley Law School when a group of law students at Berkeley said they all signed a pact that they would have no Zionist speakers, right? And I think, Ken, you might have argued, well, look, that's a political perspective. Zionism can be a political perspective, and so they shouldn't be viewed as discriminating against Jewish students. And I sort of agree with that in the abstract, but I noted, by the way, that the dean of the Jewish dean of the law school, Dean Cherminsky, I think I said his name.
Yeah, Erwin Chemerinsky.
Cherminsky, right. recently wrote an op-ed talking about the levels of anti-Semitism he was experiencing at Berkeley after October 7th.
The extension of what happened is that
Yeah.
that same group started putting posters of him with fangs and blood coming out of him, and then assaulted his open house with his wife
Right.
at his
Yeah,
home.
yes.
And so that was in many ways an extension of what seemed to be an ideological distinction, really descended very quickly into rank
In the
anti-Semitism.
abstract, the anti-Zionism may not have been anti-Semitism, but in the world that we live in, it certainly turned out that way.
Yeah, and my objection to what the Berkeley students did was also, I called it, I said they had the right because you wouldn't force a group to decide, a young Republican that they have to bring in a Bernie supporter or so forth. So the politics of this. But I also called it McCarthyism, because I think to me that's really what the essence of it. When you see some ideas that you disagree with is so evil that you can't have them in the same space, to me that was the essence of it. It was McCarthyism. But but also the Irwin's experience has been awful, and and he's also a champion of free speech. I mean, people didn't. He also represented Rachel Corrie. So he has a long line of protecting speech, but that
And he specifically says that he hadn't commented about Israel
No, that's
publicly at all.
Right.
So their attacks on him were purely because he was a Jew.
Well, I don't know that I agree with that. I think it was also, if you look at, he's the dean of a law school. He's in the administration. Part of what they're asking for is divestment, and so is he the only administrator that people are talking about, protesting in front of houses and so forth? No, but the sign with was over the top.
So is there a sense that maybe there was this kind of rarefied, abstract academic difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism prior to October 7th? It feels a lot more aligned post-October 7th than it did before.
I don't know that I would agree with that. I mean, I think that this is event has certainly charged and changed the world in many, many ways. But the Palestinians that I talked to, including people like Rashid Khalidi, who I disagree with, but was very quick to condemn what Hamas did, and he's getting vilified now as being too friendly to Zionists. But their objection to Zionism is rooted in something fundamental in how they look at the world. Again, one of the things that I think is a good exercise is imagine if you were born in a different circumstance. So, if you were born Palestinian, would you think of the whole question of Zionism differently? And one sort of vignette that illustrates this is from my book. I needed to put sort of a short description of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, the story about the Bible and the connection to the land and the meaning in the religion and the synagogues facing that way and so forth. That story about the origin story of the Jewish connection to the land and Zionism. And then I needed the Palestinian story, which is basically they were there, there were always Jews, but starting in the 1880s, they started having this influx of Jews, and then more, in the post, the Holocaust. And, I had those two stories that I put together, and I shared the draft with a bunch of people. And one person wrote back and said, it's really important which one you start with. And I thought about that, and I said, you're right. And I started with the Jewish story because I was much more comfortable with it. But I have a long footnote at the end relating that comment and said, how would you have felt if I had started with the Palestinian story and then brought in Jews as secondary characters, mostly to thwart what their desires were? Well, that's how they see when Jews tell the story of our connection to the land of Israel. So I do see it in many ways as the anti-Zionism as just a manifestation of a larger competing narrative.
So before I open up to some questions, just one last question to both of you about the generational divide in particular. I'm very, very sensitive to the sense that there are some young people who grew up particularly within perhaps our religion school program and feel that we we didn't talk enough about the occupation. I reject that a little bit because
That's my wife who's a rabbi.
for 23 years, I had former PLO folks speaking from my bima before it was popular or even acceptable to do so. So it's not as if we didn't have the other ideology. I often think that some of this generational divide is rooted in a struggle between universalism and particularism amongst our youth, and maybe a lack of historical context that they, and kind of to your point, so besotted by kind of a universalist approach and only understanding, for example, tikkun olam, without balancing that with a sense of ahavat Yisrael, and really just kind of doubling down on tikkun olam as the sine qua non of what it is to have to live out as a Jew. What's your sense of kind of some of that? You both have worked with young people closely. What's your sense of that being maybe some of the essence of the generational divide?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there is a generational divide. It is showing up in the data. I will say, though, that we often exaggerate it. There was a study that just came out by Hillel a couple days ago, and it showed that among the students that they surveyed, there were more conservatives than there were progressives among them. It was something like 19% characterized themselves as conservatives and 17% characterized themselves as progressives, and there were more liberals and moderates than both. So I think it's easy to say, oh, these young people are all turning. No, they're not. Some are. Certainly there's a higher percentage of young Jews who have bought into this narrative than their parents, and we're seeing that shift. But I think it's easy to exaggerate it and then to cater to it in a way that is actually not healthy and not good, because there are many normie Jewish kids out there who just want a nice Shabbat meal and who don't want to be hit over the head with ideology or criticism of Israel or anything else. They're looking for something very different, and I think we sometimes do a disservice to them by thinking that all the young Jews have become progressives. But I don't entirely agree with the universalism versus particularism. I think there's some of that at work here, but I think younger Jews are drawn to an ideology that tends to divide the world up into oppressors and oppressed. And that ideology is being applied to the Israel-Palestinian issue. And look, I think our generation of American Jews was extremely universalistic, extremely civil-minded. So I don't think that, and tikkun olam has been a dominant idea within Jewish life for a long, long time. We've long had this sense that to be good Jews, we had to be good universalists as well. But I think this ideology is what is shifting. I also agree, by the way, I don't buy this idea entirely. I think, again, I don't want to fall into the same binary thinking that, that it's all about, not being told the truth about the occupation. When I was at the David Project, which was a very pro-Israel organization, unabashedly pro-Israel organization, I had something called the no surprise rule. The students were not going to leave high school surprised by anything that they heard, and I wanted them to be exposed to every possible argument and every possible narrative. And that was a dominant idea going back even in 2010 when I took over at that organization. So I don't entirely buy it. I do think that a younger generation has been more impacted by ideological trends than their older siblings and certainly their parents were, and that explains the drift in this other direction more than any other single factor.
Ken, you're on a college campus. Thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think I agree with David. There's no simple, one thing. I think there are a lot of different things. 20 years ago, just talking about students in general, what was the complaint? They're apathetic. So, we may not like all their activism, but they're at least more engaged in thinking about their relationship with the world. I think part of it is also they've seen a different Israel than we grew up with. I remember the Oslo. I remember Shimon Peres. I remember Rabin talking, the handshake. All those images. When was the last time we saw something like that? All they've seen is Israel lurching further to the right, and they've seen the lack of, not that the Palestinian Authority, it's corrupt, it's dysfunctional, all those things, absolutely true. But I think they haven't seen any evidence, because there is no evidence, of Israel trying to make the Palestinian Authority succeed over the last number of decades. And so I think that's part of the result of that, is the dynamic that we're seeing on the ground, and the students are seeing that as well. So I think that's part of the parcel. And I don't know where this is, again, I don't know what the other side of this is. We're still in the middle of it, but I think, I wouldn't give up on those students. I don't think we're going to, make them into pro-Israel supporters, but I think we need to engage them in terms of, at least on the campus, what the academy can do. When I talk to colleges, I basically say to students towards the end, I could be wrong, but I don't think any of you is going to solve Israel-Palestine. That what you can control is how you treat each other. And aren't you sort of interested in why it is that somebody who's a friendly student in some other class has this diametrically opposed view of Israel? And even if you're just to be a better advocate, isn't it incumbent upon you to understand what makes that side tick better? I'll finish with this. One of the things in the book that I have at the last chapter is sort of a blueprint for how to deal with the campus. And one of the things that I highlighted was a course that I absolutely love and I wish could be expanded. Some of you may remember a few years ago that J Street U had a student president who was Pakistani Muslim. I said, boy, this is interesting. So I'm on a listserv with a lot of faculty, and I question about it. And there's a guy named Paul Sham who teaches Israel studies at University of Maryland, and he said, she was in my class. And so I reached out to her and talked about what the class was. It was a simulation class. So it was about half of the semester was built around the Peel Commission of the 1930s, where the Brits sent Lord Peel to talk to the Jews and the Arabs, and what the heck are we going to do? So the students had to faithfully represent one of the characters in the Peel Commission, either a Brit, a Jew, or an Arab. Amna, the Pakistani Muslim, had to be David Ben Gurion for 6 or 8 weeks and faithfully represent him. And when I talked to her, she said, "You think that was weird? I had an Israeli classmate who had to be the Mufti." And as much of a pain in the butt as he was, the Jabotinsky figure on my side was much more difficult to deal with. So real education. And then I talked to the person who actually designed this, and she said, students would come into this class saying, gee, I'll know how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should have been, settled years ago. And they come out of it saying, gee, now I know 80 some odd years after the Peel Commission why it's still going on. That's what education can do. It can break down some of the binaries and make people think about things outside their comfort zone.
Wonderful. So we have time for a couple questions, and just particularly because this is a group of majority Jews, questions are not statements. Questions are questions. But I'm going to just, if you can just raise your hand, say it out loud, I'm going to repeat it for online so they can hear. But I'm going to Phil Donahue, but I'm not going to give up the mic. I've been burned before. Yes, please.
So we are increasingly aware of sponsoring of especially Qatari funds into our educational system. And some people connect that flow of money with the current situation on campuses. Is this something to be concerned about, or do you think this is just a coincidence?
So do we have some concern about the fact, particularly there's some from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as well, but Qatari money particularly that has gone for decades, billions of dollars sponsoring various programs, particularly Middle East studies in universities. Is that something that we should be concerned about? Does that put a thumb on the scale of this kind of more open inquiry on college campuses? What, David?
Yeah. I mean, the answer is yes, but I think it's also possible to overstate it. There are a lot of people in the Jewish world say, well, you got to follow the money, and obviously that's important, and Qatari money fund certain Middle Eastern programs, and those places tend not to be ones that, that have high regard for the Jewish narrative around Israel. But again, these are homegrown ideological trends. I mean, in the late 1960s, a group of students managed to get the first ethnic studies programs into San Francisco State University, and they spread in universities across the country. Qatar didn't pay for that. Saudi Arabia didn't pay for that. And I think there's a lot of universities where you can't even discuss.
Probably the state of California paid for that.
State of California paid for it, and thank you, California, because it's spreading around the United States. So I think that we should look at Qatari funding. I think it is one of the factors. I would say maybe third or fourth on my list, but we shouldn't overlook the others.
Ken?
Yeah,
Sorry,
and I would also say that I wouldn't, blame the Qataris for everything that's going on. But I would also say that, it's more complicated in terms of just the Qatari funding, because one of the things that happened is the head of the Secure Community Network that deals with the protection of synagogues and so forth was also getting Qatari money. Was in Qatar, I think, when 9/11 happened. So, it's not just funding on one side, and it's too simple a solution, but it's part of it.
Part of it. Yes, Neil.
Yeah, in the real world, anti-Semitism fuels anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism fuels anti-Semitism. Why do we have the need to slice this so thin? Because in the real world, it doesn't really matter. I know when I see anti-Semitism, and I'd like to hear what you
So Neil is asking, in the real world, and I think we were talking about this in terms of the empirical experience versus the more abstract one. In the real world, particularly now, anti-Zionism feels pretty significantly to be anti-Semitism. Is there a need to create more nuance?
I mean, would you consider somebody like Peter Beinart anti-Semitic? He's gone to the point where he doesn't believe in a two-state solution. He'd like to have everybody. I mean, I disagree with him, fundamentally on the merits of it, but I don't think it's hatred of Jews that's driving where he is on the politics of it. So, to me,
Not popular at his Orthodox synagogue now,
right?
probably,
No,
but yeah.
But I wrote a thing about the definitions, and to the UN, because the people were trying to get the UN to adopt the definition. And the point I made was, look at the damage of going through the binary that Zionism is racism. Like when I talked about the British school and so forth, I said that was, Zionism can be racist, but it doesn't have to be racist, but you made it all in that category. So don't go the opposite way and make that anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism, because that's going to backfire too. It gives a simple solution to a complicated issue, and again, I think it's important to engage the complexity. I mean, part of the battle of this, and David knows from talking about the people that want to put everything in power and privilege and class and oppression and so forth, is that the driving of a lot of this is the search for binaries. And the way that we fight it is not imposing one binary over another, it's underscoring the complexity.
David, you want to, please?
The only thing I would add is that, look, in some ways I don't care. Anti-Zionism is bad in and of itself. Is it anti-Semitism? Probably mostly it is. Is it sometimes not? Probably sometimes it's not. But anti-Zionism is a scourge, and I want to fight. We have to fight that scourge. We have to, because it's undermining the credibility and legitimacy of the one Jewish state in the world. I don't need to worry that much if on some abstract level it's also anti-Semitism. And I think it's too easy to get wrapped up into these abstract questions about it and lose sight of the fact that it's a problem in and of itself. And we should fight it on because of that.
Probably one of the things we need to do proactively is we need to have a major campaign defining for ourselves what Zionism is and promulgating that a little bit and sharing that a little bit rather than letting other people define it for us.
Great.
One or two more. Yes, please, sir.
It's a two-part question.
Okay.
And I noticed on the website, the actual definition is a very short one sentence from May 26, 2016. Underneath that on the website, for example, one, or those examples dispensed upon in the same way that the definition was. Two, I do notice in the examples, there is nothing at all whatsoever about Zionism or anti-Zionism.
So the question is, IHRA, there are two key parts. One is
Right.
the singular kind of line in the gray box at the top, and then there are qualifying examples. Were those two separate kind of conceptions? And the fact that anti-Zionism or Zionism is not necessarily called out specifically.
Yeah, well, the way it got put together was, again, mostly for the purpose of the data collectors. So the examples were the core. I mean, I almost see the beginning of it as almost like a preamble, because this is the one thing that the critics and I all agree on, that the critics, my critics, that the examples were the core. That was the reason for it. Those are the heart of the definition. The first sentence by itself really means nothing. It doesn't give it direction. It does include it doesn't say about Zionism, but it says about self-determination and saying that it's a racist thing. That was written partly thinking about the Zionism-racism resolution. That's why the racism language got put in there. But again, it wasn't to say that anybody who says that shouldn't be able to assign a text or is an anti-Semite or whatever. It was put in there because, again, we did see a correlation between the idea that Jews don't have a right to self-determination, or that's a racist enterprise, with the level of anti-Semitism. But it wasn't to specifically say that if you say that, that's anti-Semitic.
One technical follow-up on that.
Sure.
It does say that legitimate. One of the critiques of IHRA is that it chills speech on campus. Yet it specifically says explicitly criticism of Israel that is proportionate to the criticism of any other country is not anti-Semitic. Doesn't that kind of cover it?
No, because of how it's been used. I mean, it's been used for that part for people to say, wait a minute, you haven't criticized Syria, you haven't criticized this other country. When I was protesting for Soviet Jews, nobody was saying that there was a problem that I wasn't going out about Tibet, right? There are reasons why you could be concerned with one thing and not another. But what I've seen is that this was, absolutely weaponized. It was making the case that BDS by itself is anti-Semitic. BDS was around in, the first academic boycott push was in 2002. I'm against the academic boycott. I think it's deplorable for all the reasons you can imagine. But we didn't put that in there. People have used it. So the problem for me is not the definition of what it says. If it had been used for its intended purposes, I'd be absolutely fine for it. People are using it as a shortcut to weaponize speech. Nobody is saying that we needed the definition to understand Kanye. Right? Right? So
I don't think there's anything that could help to understand.
It's all about it. And the funny thing, to show that this is about speech, the debate in the Congress at the moment, is the people that have piped up in the last 2 weeks, the unusual, surprising people who have talked about why this is legislation that shouldn't pass, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I haven't heard anybody bringing up deicide in the last long time. Leave it to the debate about this in Congress to bring up the deicide charge. So, Marjorie Taylor Greene says one of the examples about Jews killing Jesus. So we can't teach about the gospel. Well, you can teach about the gospels, but she's not wrong in saying that if you're worried about the speech implications, that has an implication. So the one senator said, I'll vote for it, but maybe I'll put in an amendment to take out the deicide thing from the list.
Always want to have that in your back pocket to be able to.
So, but the point is, it's about speech.
Right.
David, please.
Look, anybody can sue anybody for anything. We don't need a definition of IRA for people to say that anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. And if you look at the anti-discrimination laws more generally, which I support, by the way, we need to have anti-discrimination laws, right? We need to have protected categories of people who have been historically discriminated against. That's why we have the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Once you then say that we're going to look at what constitutes a hostile environment, and we're going to factor speech in that, we're going to have problems whether you're talking about Jews in Israel or not. In other words, we're not the only way, our issues are not the only ones that are implicated by anti-discrimination laws and by the overall campus debate. So I don't know why we should be more sensitive to the use of anti-Semitism than we are to the treatment of any other group on campus. And look, it puts people like me in a bind. I'm a free speecher, like Ken. I believe that Jews do better in free societies. And if you look at according to the survey that was taken by the campus group FIRE, what are the dead last campuses when it comes to free speech? Harvard and Penn. Harvard's rating was abysmal, and it actually had a negative free speech score. A negative free speech score, -10. When I'm saying that, I want there to be free speech, and to me that's ultimately the solution to this. But there's more than one liberal value at stake. Another liberal value is equal protection. That's also a liberal value. Mm-hmm. And I have to take that seriously. So if campuses are not going to be major bastions of free speech, and many aren't, and some of them are private universities and don't actually have to be, then I'm going to say, well, okay, then at the very least, extend equal protection to Jews and Jewish issues. Mm-hmm. Again, I'll err on the side of free speech every time, but I understand that equal protection is a value worth protecting as well.
Yeah, and you know, I agree with David that Jewish students are having a hard time at the moment. They've had a hard time before. They need to be protected. They don't need special rules, because if the rules work, Jews are protected. Michael Brooks, who was the longtime director of the group, the Hillel at Michigan, said if you make it about Jews, you lose. And what he meant by that is that if you go and create special carve-outs for how to protect Jews, it's not going to work. You're going to get faculty and students opposed. So the question is, do you make the environment on the campus work for everybody? And Jews will be included under that. But I am, concerned in the larger society about the pushing of the things to protect Jews in schools. And I'll give you an example of what happened in Tennessee. They passed an IRA legislation so that you can't teach, quote, anti-Semitic concepts. What are those anti-Semitic concepts? Ones that somebody's going to potentially sue over that violates IRA in their views, because it can undo your funding. Who did the Jewish community get to push this in Tennessee? A Republican state legislator. What else was he known for? He proposed that the Bible should be the official book of Tennessee. This is who we picked. What else did he do? He put in a bill that passed to ban certain books for being age inappropriate. When they asked, what should we do with these books, what do you think he said? So we're aligning with book burners because we don't like certain speech. That's different than protecting Jewish students from actual harassment, intimidation, and so forth. We should encourage them how to respond to speech, not in communal advocacy, but in intellectual discourse, but absolutely make sure they're protected from actual threat, but not from intellectual threat.
We're going to end there. Thank you very much, everybody. Please give it up. And thank you all for, on a gorgeous night, being here with us indoors. Thank you. Go out and enjoy.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you for having us.
Let's turn that off.
Yeah, right. Off. Okay.
I learned the hard way.
Okay. Oh, how does it turn off?
You have to open that up again. I just don't remember. Listen, where those little things are over there.